I would not change the beginning for anything. I had an electric car, a starched white nanny, a pony, a bed modeled after that of Napoleon's son, and I was baptized by the Archbishop of the diocese. I wore hats and sucked on a Litli pipe. I was the darling of the ranch, pleasing everyone. One day I was sunning myself in the patio, lying out on the yellow and blue tiles, contemplating the geraniums and sniffing the hot, clean air. A bee came up and stung me on my bare fanny. The response to my screams was wonderful. Servants everywhere, my mother giving orders. Don Enrique applied an old Indian remedy and my father took me down to the beach house to let the salt water do its work. Oh, what a world it was! Was there ever so pampered an ass as mine? When my father was away on location, I would go to the tack room where Don Enrique sat polishing the saddles and the bridles and the boots and get him to tell me more stories about my father, how he became an honorary Apache and shot crocodiles on the Amazon, how he was good to his horses and courted my mother making wrong romance. My father said that Don Enrique's stories were true and wasn't I lucky having such a wise old man around. Then he would tell me more stories and I would go to sleep on his big shoulder with my arms around him.
He was born at New Lynn in 1930, with Amalgamated on one side and Crum on the other, and died in 1988, out past Tiri in the Hauraki Gulf. He was the author of 9 books of poetry and a small amount of fugitive and occasional verse. He had 2 wives, 2 daughters and 2 sons, but his first wife, Sho is mistaken, told me once he never married. How comfortable it would be to leave him to his memoirist, Elfin John, who sees a running fire of brilliance over him. We need all the brilliance we can got. John fills his book with jokes, occasions, parties, bon mots. Even I, the other John, the Jack, say something smart now and then. The poet falls over on a flight of steps and bleeds into the cup of his hands. Does anybody happen to have a wafer? Jack Ski asks. We don't need any more of that sort of thing. I know jokes the elf can't tell because he wasn't there most of the time, but I'm not going to put them in unless they do more than raise a laugh.
I was born at the end of a gay decade in a small town called Wadesville, later to be a quiet suburb of Auckland. My father was 53 when I was born. He worked the apple and pear orchard he had planted after the First War. Father was a failed lawyer, a Presbyterian for the sake of household peace, a leaner towards free thought. At his funeral a Unitarian friend of his described him to me as a rationalist monk and, less accurately, a scholar hermit. His years of manhood were a struggle for privacy no less desperate for being secret first from his housekeeper sister Jane, then from my mother. Mother was a plain, prim, thoughtful woman whose Sunday acquaintance with Jane had ripened, on her part at least, into friendship. She grieved for Sour Jane when she died, a wasting disease, and imagined Faith helpless and lonely. They were married in 1927. In the wedding photograph my father looked sheepish and my mother determined. I was born in 1928, when she was nearly 40. I was christened Paul Emerson Pryor. Emerson was mother's maiden name, which father was pleased to have me bear for a reason he thought it wise not to mention to her. It gave me the initials P.E.P. and doomed me as a teacher to the nickname Pepsi.
Johnson went to New Zealand after the war because men he had met in France had talked of it as a pleasant and well-to-do country. He had been billeted with some New Zealanders in a rest camp, and the way they talked about it made it seem like the only country in the world. In that period, just at the end of the war, the distance and strangeness that such a journey involved in going there to a new country with no money, was slight beside everything else that had happened to him in the last 4 years of his life. He was demobilized early and sailed in March 1919 with an assisted emigrant's ticket. The ship that he sailed on carried convalescent soldiers and emigrating Englishmen with their children and families. 4 people died on the voyage, 2 from pneumonic influenza, 1 armless soldier from wasting and blood poison, and 1 old lady from heart failure in the heat near Panama, so that funeral services at intervals regulated the conduct of the ship. A stale tiredness hung over everyone and made the voyage long and wearying. It lasted 6 weeks, but they came in early one morning to Auckland, and when Johnson came on deck he could see the new country that he had chosen to live in.
Bastard, she'd think, looking out her back kitchen window. Lucky white bastard, at that glimpse of two-story house through its surround of big old trees and its oh-so-secure greater surround of rolling green pasture land, while she'd clicking her tongue, oh to hell with him. Or good luck to him, if she wasn't in too bad a mood. Good luck to you, white man, for being born into your sweet world, and bad luck to you, Beth Heek, who used to be a Ransfield, but not that life was so much better then, for being married to an arsehole. And yet I love him. Just can't help myself, I love the black, fist-happy bastard. And she'd light another smoke, and always went AJJ in her mind and sometimes aloud because she liked that first hit against the back of her throat, and she'd squint through the drifts. And wonder. And sometimes she'd be upstairs, looking out her bedroom window at the view on the other side of the house, the front. If you could call it a U, just a mirror reflection across the street of her house and the half next door and the whole fucking street of exact same state dwellings. A mile-long picture of the same thing, all the same, just two-story, side-by-side misery boxes. Only thing different was the color of the paint job, and even then you hardly noticed it. And your neighbor threw a few inches of wall. And Beth watched.
My name is Roimata Carolina, and I'm married to Hemi Tamihana. We have 4 children, James, Tanjimona, Manu, and Tokawaru Marama. We live by the sea, which hems and stitches the scalloped edges of the land. This piece of land is the family land of the Tamihanas. Our houses stand close together on this, the Papakainga, and they window the neatened curve of sea. Towards this curve we pitch our eyes constantly, tides of eyes rolling in reverse action to the sea. The house we live in is the old family home positioned at the contra of the curve. On either side of us are the other Tamihana families, and at the far end, near to the hills, is the little Waranui where Hemi's sister Mary goes every day with her brush and polishing cloths to clean and shine. While she works she sings, sometimes softly, sometimes loudly, to herself and to the house. I have loved Hemi since I was 5. Our son James is like his father, quiet and sure, and with the patience that the earth has. Although firstborn, it was James who came most easily from between the thines. His cries caused no earth tremble or sky rumble, no ripple on the midnight hour. Tanjimona is a year younger than her brother. She is not patient, but is as sharp-edged as the sea rocks, and hears every whisper of the tide. On the night she was born I woke to the pained crying of the sea. We took her name from the sounds that the sea made. Manu is.
He was bored with the lecture. He got up quietly, picked up his books, left the lecture hall through the back door and went to the student cafeteria. It was lunchtime. Almost all the tables were occupied. He put his books on a vacant table near the large windows overlooking the harbor. He waited nearly 30 minutes, so he noticed on the cafeteria clock, in the queue at the counter before he was able to buy a meat pie and a cup of coffee. When he got back to his table he found a girl sitting in one of the chairs. She was writing on a pad and didn't pay him any attention. He sat down. He preferred eating alone. He started eating and soon forgot the girl. It had rained nearly all that morning. The windowpane was blistered with raindrops. He watched them as they slid, like peeling strips of skin, down the glass. The dark heads of the trees immediately below the windows nodded noiselessly in the wind. He suddenly felt the girl watching him. He continued staring at the window and sipping his coffee. She stretched her left hand forward as if to touch his arm but abruptly withdrew it when he glanced at her. He looked at the window again. A passenger liner was plowing a thin furrow of foam across the dark blue waters of the harbor, heading for the entrance. From that distance.
But old Mrs. Goodman did die at last. Theodora went into the room where the coffin lay. She moved one hairbrush 3 inches to the left, and smoothed the antimacassar on a little Empire preview that her mother had brought from Europe. She did all this with some surprise, as if divorced from her own hands, as if they were related to the objects beneath them only in the way that 2 flies, blowing and blundering in space, are related to a china and mahogany world. It was all very surprising, the accomplished as opposed to the contemplated fact. It had altered the silence of the house. It had altered the room. This was no longer the bedroom of her mother. It was a waiting room, which housed the shiny box that contained a waxwork. Theodora had told them to close the box before the arrival of Fanny and Frank, who were not expected till the afternoon. So the box was closed, even at the expense of what Fanny would say. She would talk about last glimpses, and cry. She had not lived with Mrs. Goodman in her latter years. From her own house she wrote and spoke of dear mother, making her an idea, just as people will talk of democracy or religion, at a moral distance. But Theodora was the spinster. She had lived with her mother, and helped her into her clothes. She came when the voice called.
He walks down the street. The asphalt reels by him. It is all silence. The silence is music. He is the singer. The people passing smile and shake their heads. He holds a hand out to them. They open with them. The light is blinding, he loves the light. They are the light. He walks down the street. The asphalt is hot and soft with sun. The people passing smile and call out greetings. He smiles and calls back. His mind is full of change and curve and hope, and he knows it is being lightly tapped. He laughs. Maybe there is the dance, as she says. Creation and change, destruction and change. New Mary from the old Mary, a beginning from the end. His mind weaves it into a spiral fretted with stars. He holds out his hand, and it is gently taken. She walls down the street. The asphalt sinks beneath her muscled feet. She whistles softly as she walks. Sometimes she smiles. The people passing smile too, but duck their heads in a deferential way as though her smile is too sharp. She grins more at their lowered heads. She can dig out each thought, each reaction, outrun the gray brains, out through the bones.
There were 27 in our party. Besides George Dixon, our manager, and Jimmy Duncan, coach. Billy Stead was a bootmaker. Bob Deans, a farmer. Bunny Abbott, a farrier and professional runner. Dave Gallagher, a meatworks foreman. Billy Carbine Wallace, a foundryman. Jimmy Hunter farmed in Mangamahu, northeast of Wanganui. Fred Fats Newton. Massa Johnston. Jimmy O'Sullivan. Bill Cunningham was a miner. Frank Glasgow, a bank officer. George Bubbs Tyler, swimmer and boat builder. Steve Casey. Simon Minot. Eric Harper, farmer. George Smith, former jockey, professional runner. George Gillett. Freddie Roberts. Mona Thompson, a civil servant. Duncan McGregor. George Nicholson was a blacksmith and bootmaker. Bill McCrell. Billy Glenn, farmer. Ernest Booth. Bill Corbett, miner. Alec McDonald. And Charlie Bronco Sealing. August 8, 1905. A crowd of 100 braved the sleet and cold to see us off. We stood by with our luggage and football boots, our collars turned up against the weather, aboard the SS Rumataka, and slowly like a big log wedge then freeing itself midstream, our lives came round to port then stern, then out to the heads, whereupon the tugs dipped their flags, and clinging together the tugmen gathered on the oardeck with their farewell song.
In which a stranger arrives in Hokitika, a secret council is disturbed. Walter Moody conceals his most recent memory. And Thomas Balfour begins to tell a story. The 12 men congregated in the smoking room of the Crown Hotel gave the impression of a party accidentally met. From the variety of their comportment and dress, frock coats, tailcoats, Norfolk jackets with buttons of horn, yellow moleskin, cambric, and twill, they might have been 12 strangers on a railway car, each bound for a separate quarter of a city that possessed fog and tides enough to divide them. Indeed, the studied isolation of each man as he pored over his paper, or leaned forward to tap his ashes into the grate, or placed the splay of his hand upon the bay to take his shot at billiards. Conspired to form the very type of bodily silence that occurs, late in the evening, on a public railway, decadent here not by the slur and clunk of the coaches, but by the fat clatter of the rain. Such was the perception of Mr. Walter Moody, from where he stood in the doorway with his hand upon the frame. He was innocent of having disturbed any kind of private conference, for the speakers had ceased when they heard his tread in the passage. By the time he opened the door, each of the 12 men had resumed his occupation, rather haphazardly, on the part of the billiard players, for they had forgotten their places, with such a careful how of absorption that no one even glanced up when he stepped into the room.
I'm a retired high school teacher who only taught history, and I'm not important. I was born in the Taranaki and so was my wife, Josie, whom I met in the 1960s. In those days, if you were a young bloke like me, you got drunk after playing rugby with your mates and hoped you'd meet some nice girl at the pub. That's where Josie caught my eye. She was out painting the town red with some of her girlfriends, though she likes to change that story now and tells people we met at the local Sunday school picnic. Yeah, right. Josie and I got married and, a few years later, bought our 3-bedroom bungalow here in New Plymouth. We honeymooned in Australia and, since then, we've had a trip to London and another one to Hong Kong to see New Zealand play at the Rugby Sevens. We've lived in New Plymouth all our lives, and have 3 children and 7 mokapuna. Josie's saving up to take them to Disneyland. As for the bungalow, well, we bought it for the view of Taranaki Mountain. New Plymouth at that time was a small town with oil rigs off the coast. Look at it now, prosperous port, tourism, an art gallery, even a mall. A lot of the original outlook has gone as other houses have mushroomed around us, but we still have a great view from the sitting room, and the bathroom too, if you open the window when you're sitting on the lav.
The same week our fowls were stolen, Daphne Moran had her throat cut. Big dunce that I was at school. My essays, if not my spelling, used to be thought quite good, and I was a keen reader, which is probably why I now presume to set myself up as the chronicler of Clinham's Hour in the limelight. This was certainly the most hectic and the darkest chapter in the whole history of the town, and, just like I have heard said, murder will out, it seems to me that the true story is bursting to be told sooner or later. It may be that I am biting off more than I can chew in tackling the job, but who, I ask myself, is going to come to light if I do not accept the challenge? Who was more constantly mixed up in every scene than little me? But nobody. And whose family knew more of any ins and outs that I may have missed myself than my own family? Echo answers whose. So it looks like it is over to me to go ahead and, in retrospect, piece together the entire grisly and dramatic episode. Nearly all should turn out to be a genuine blow-by-blow account. Some of it will have been told to me, of course, and some extra elusive bits and pieces may force me to use my imagination, but surely I get some license if I am really going to blow the top off that strange affair at last. Grant me a little license, then, is my plea. In Treasure Island, I liked the sound of the same broadside. I lost my leg, old Pew lost his deadlight.
A week after midsummer, when the festival fires were cold, and decent people were in bed an hour after sunset, not lying dry-mouthed in dark rooms at midday, a young man named Sobran Jodo stole 2 of the freshly bottled wines to baptize the first real sorrow of his life. Though the festival was past, everything was singing, frogs making chamber music in the cistern near the house, and dark grasshoppers among the vines. Sobran stepped out of his path to crush one insect, watched its shiny limbs flicker then finally contract, and sat by the corpse as it stilled. The young man glanced at his shadow on the ground. It was substantial. With the moon just off full and the soil sandy, all shadows were sharp and faithful. Sobran slid the blade of his knife between the bottle neck and cork, and slowly eased it free. He took a swig of the friand, tasted fruit and freshness, a flavor that turned briefly and looked back over its shoulder at the summer before last, but didn't pause, even to shade its eyes. The wine turned thus for the first few mouthfuls, then seemed simply a beverage, as Father Lacey would say, the spinster's priest from whom Sobran and his brother, Leon, had their letters. The wine's now pure chemical power poured from Sobran's gut into his blood. He felt miserable, overripe, well past any easy relief.
In the old days, in the years that have gone before us, the land and sea felt a great emptiness, a yearning. The mountains were like a stairway to heaven, and the lush green rainforest was a rippling cloak of many colors. The sky was iridescent, swirling with the patterns of wind and clouds, sometimes it reflected the prisms of rainbow or southern aurora. The sea was ever-changing, shimmering and seamless to the sky. This was the well at the bottom of the world, and when you looked into it you felt you could see to the end of forever. This is not to say that the land and sea were without life, without vivacity. The tuatara, the ancient lizard with its third eye, was sentinel here, unblinking in the hot sun, watching and waiting to the east. The moa browsed in giant wingless herds across the southern island. Within the warm stomach of the rainforests, kiwi, weka, and the other birds foraged for hohu and similar succulent insects. The forests were loud with the clatter of tree bark, chatter of cicada, and murmur of fish-laden streams. Sometimes the forest grew suddenly quiet, and in wet bush could be heard the filigree of fairy laughter like a sparkling glissando. The sea, too, teemed with fish, but they also seemed to be waiting. They swam in brilliant shoals, like rains of glittering dust, throughout the greenstone depths of Puku, Manga, Kehai, Tamur, Moki, and Werha herded by shark or mango Yuraroa. Sometimes from far off a white shape would be seen flying through the sea, but it would only be the serene flight of the tarawai, the stingray with the spike on its tail.